Um, Hello, Mustafa, and hello, everyone. I hope that you can hear me.
I can hear you perfectly well. Hello.
Okay, great. Sorry, there was a technical hitch on my end, so I was just trying to to join as a moderator. Um, Welcome, Mustafa, to Istanbul Network webinar, and welcome everyone who have already joined the room virtually. This is a new and exciting experience for us, and first time we are doing this webinar with starting with you, Mustafa Akyol, and I'm really looking forward to you. I guess that we have introduced already through our announcements what is the format, but let me do it again here.
Mhm.
The title of this talk, Mustafa and everyone, is Reforms in the Islamic World, a la Luther or a la Locke, which is based on your article which you published last year in Atlantic, in which you had differentiated what kind of reform strategy or pathway to reforms are needed in the Muslim world. And I guess that that will be sort of a center of discussion today. And we would request you to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we will go on for more interactive discussions with everyone here.
Mhm. So, thank you so much, Ali, and hello and salam alaikum, and good afternoon or good morning wherever you are in the world right now. Thanks for having this. It's a pleasure, and Istanbul Network is a very important organization that I've been a part of for many years and doing something really important. And this is an important topic, so I'm glad I have a chance to speak. I see some old friends, Iyad, Linda, and personally want to extend my regards to them and for everybody, of course, in the room. Now, let me begin with this. Why do we need reforms in the Muslim world in the first place? Maybe this is just an idea that has to be questioned in the first place. What is this all talk about? I'm sure many Muslims around the world will say, why do we need anything like this? I mean, why are these guys trying to insert these foreign concepts into our language and into our intellectual scene? Something happened on my end, lost the screen. Is everything okay? Do you all see me?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Um, Ali, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Mustafa. Please go ahead.
Okay, I don't see myself, but okay, I'll assume everything is okay. So I'll begin with this. I think overwhelmingly most Muslims will agree that the state of the Muslim world is not something to be proud of in the past couple of centuries. There was a time that Muslims were, the pioneers in sciences and was the most powerful and advanced civilization, and we were inventing algebra and, and, and medicine and advancing a lot of, thoughts and philosophy and so on and so forth. So we were proud of the Ottoman Majesty or the Abbasid Caliphate and so on and so forth. But in the past couple of centuries, the Muslim world is in a bad state of affairs, and probably everybody agrees on that. Different solutions. Uh, why are we in a bad state of affairs? Well, Muslim world is economically weak. It doesn't produce much. If you leave aside oil, the Muslim countries really produce very little compared to others of the world. We produce very little science. And because of all that weakness, and we have been colonized, and then after colonization, we created nation states and so on and so forth. But most of these are despotic states. There are hardly any, free countries in the Muslim world. Only Tunisia lately, has been upgraded to the level of a free country. But most Muslim countries are not free in terms of political and civil liberties, religious freedom. Some of them are half free. There are conflicts, deep conflicts in the Muslim world, civil wars, wars between Muslim states, wars within Muslim states. So the Muslim world is not in a good shape. Probably everybody agrees on. Now, why are we in this bad shape? Uh, One way to answer this question is to say someone did this to us. Like, we are in this bad state because the dark forces in the world conspired against us. They used evil techniques, conspiracies, plus whatever to bring Muslims to this evil state of affairs, this bad state of affairs. That is honestly quite popular in the Muslim world because it makes us feel a bit better. Like we are in this bad state of affairs because someone, it could be the Westerners, the Jews, the hypocrites among us, the traitors among us, or this sect or that group, and the other Muslims, the Shia or the Ahmadis, or this. I mean, somebody did this to us. The people or the liberals did this to us, and this conspiratorial narrative is very powerful. And actually, I think the explosion of conspiracy theory in the Muslim world, which is a modern phenomenon, has a lot to do with this effort to explain the bad state of affairs. Uh, I think this, I mean, and by having said this, I should grant that yes, I mean, the Muslim world has suffered a lot from external forces. Colonialism is a destructive force, was a destructive force. So there has been a lot of forces on us that really made everything worse. But I think blaming only this outside so-called conspiracy doesn't solve anything. It actually deepens our conflicts because we blame each other for being agents of the conspiracy and keep fighting among each other. And 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 it stops us from looking into the more internal roots of the problem. And when we look at the internal roots of the problem, oh, you will see, oh, the Muslim world is lagging behind in economy, in science, in political organization, in creating a culture of tolerance and pluralism, and so on and so forth. You ultimately ask why? And not everything is directly related to religion. There are religious reasons for the problems. Why I'm saying there are religious reasons for the problems? Well, look at Iraq and Syria today. There's a tension, conflict between Shia and certain elements of the Sunni forces in Iraq and Syria. And this is a political conflict on the one hand. These are authoritarian despotic states, so somebody captures the state and are excluded, so this creates a tension. But also, if you look, oh, you will see Salafis who will condemn the Shia as Rafidis, and you know that they think that they deserve death, and you will see some Shia looking at the Sunnis, the Yazid, and they have a religious understanding of the other side. So there's sectarianism. So it has a political side, but there's a doctrinaire side as well. Or when you look at why don't we have civil liberties? Why don't we have political liberties in the Muslim world? Well, there are just despots who just use power as elsewhere in the world. But then you see, you know, religious justification of despotism, or you see religious justification of suppressing free speech. You see, you know, bans on blasphemy, apostasy, and people can be killed for changing their religion or threatened to be killed for changing their religion, and so on and so forth. Of course, one could say the religious doctrine is just fine and the implications are just fine, no problem with that. But from looking from a perspective of why things have gone bad, I look at the bad, I see bad consequences. And when I look at it, I see some religious doctrine behind that. So therefore, I am of opinion that the mainstream religious teachings that we have in the Muslim world today needs some questioning, needs some reinterpretation, some renewal, and yes, maybe a reform. But whenever I use the word reform, I emphasize that I don't mean reform in the sense of the Protestant Reformation. That is an analogy that comes up all the time, especially in the West, because Westerners think in terms of their own history and think that the Protestant Reformation was an important step forward, and then came after that democracy and freedom of speech and so on and so forth. So, and they think that maybe it's a Luther. That's a common thing that you hear. I don't agree with that because we don't have the problem that Luther and other Protestants were facing. That's one problem. There was a centralized Catholic Church in the Middle Ages which was suppressing dissent and diversity and free thought, science, And we don't have that problem. We don't have a centralized Catholic Church. We rather actually have a very decentralized, like a very fractured world. That's one thing. Secondly, Protestant Reformation didn't bring actually good to Europe, at least right away. It brought centuries of religious wars and persecution, and Protestants were not liberal or any. I mean, most of them. There was a diversity of that. They were also believing that heretics should be burned at the stake, so the Protestants were not liberal. What brought the more admirable liberal democracies of the West today? And again, people can say, "Oh, liberal democracies are horrible things." We can discuss that, but I think liberal democracy has so far in human history the best political system devised, at least in the modern era. They came out not directly to Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation triggered something obviously big in Europe. They came out out of the Enlightenment. They came out of ideas of tolerance, diversity, ideas of freedom of speech, ideas of freedom of religion, equality before law, rule of law, markets, right to private property and enterprise and so forth. So they came out of the liberal tradition of the Enlightenment. Came out of John Locke or Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and so on and so forth. What we call as classical liberalism today. So, and when I look at the Muslim world today, I see parts of the Muslim world very much pre-Enlightenment, if there is a historical knowledge. You can say there's no need for any historical knowledge. Every civilization is a civilization, doesn't have to follow the same route. There's an argument for that. I see that. But then there are maybe similarities. And because, I mean, the idea that people should be killed for, punished at least somehow for heresy or apostasy was there in Europe as well. It was overcome by the Enlightenment with a lot of effort. The idea that criticizing the government as sedition was there in even until early 19th century, and it was early 20th century, and it was overcome later by more arguments for free speech and so on. So we are somewhere, therefore, in not the whole Muslim world, of course, is not monolithic, but especially so-called Islamic states, like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the states who claim to uphold the Sharia. And also in other states that are not explicitly Islamic, but let's say Egypt. Take Egypt. Today, Egypt is considering banning atheism as a dangerous ideology, a worldview, a misguided worldview. And that is something you would find in Europe or the West a few centuries ago. Now, if we want to achieve liberal democracies in the Muslim world, and again, people can object, but I want to achieve liberal democracy, there needs to be a revisiting of the religious teaching that we have at hand as Islam. And because, well, I mean, if you look at Muslim world, you will see, I mean, if you look at our doctrine, for example, a burning issue is apostasy. I recently spoke about it in Malaysia and got arrested for saying apostasy probably should not be a crime, which shows that this is a serious issue. People can lose heart in one religion. People can turn from Islam to Christianity, other religion. People can become secular. This happens. And from a liberal democratic point of view, you can say, well, it's a choice what you can do. You can try to persuade them still. If they change their opinion, that if their feelings, hearts changes, what can you do? Well, but in classical for Sunni schools of Islam and also the Jafari school in Shia Islam, it is a crime punishable by death, and that is implemented in some countries. In let's say 10 at least Muslim countries, predominantly Muslim countries. And what do we do with this? I would argue, well, let's go consider why apostasy is a crime. Actually, it's not in the Quran. It's actually coming from some hadiths. Those hadiths are disputable. Scholars interpreted this issue at a time when the idea of religious freedom or individual liberty was not established, and your religious allegiance was also your political allegiance. They made a decision based on their time and context. We live in a different time and context today, so we can reinterpret that. This is a very simple example of what I mean by reform. By reform, I don't mean like cutting a part of the Quran and taking it out, or these kind of sometimes ridiculous ideas come from the West. What I mean is rereading the Quran, going through the hadiths, going through our religious sources, and reinterpreting them in the light of the modern era. And already people have been suggesting this and doing this since the 19th century. It began with Muhammad Abduh in Egypt, certain Ottoman liberals in late Ottoman Empire. It went on in the century. Figures like Fazlur Rahman developed this idea of historicity of Islam, that there's a divine core of Islam, but there's a historical context in which it developed. And that historical context itself is not sacred. That historical context is a historical era, and now we are in a different historical context. So we can go through this. Of course, who is we, and who's going to do that? That is a very difficult question. And since there is no central authority in Islam, this can only happen organically. This can only happen by Muslim intellectuals, Muslim clerics, Muslim authorities, institutions, changing their opinions and their attitudes, ultimately that their laws, the laws of the certain laws of the states that we have, towards more freedom, to diversity, towards more tolerance, towards not persecuting Ahmadis in Pakistan, for example, or towards not suppressing the Shia in Saudi Arabia, or towards allowing criticisms of the government in most Arab states, and in Turkey even today, I should say, not criminalizing it. So this is a very difficult goal to achieve, and no wonder the Enlightenment didn't take place right away. It took place with individuals who are, risking their lives, or it took place with some, pioneering figures having some ideas and planting some thoughts, and others advancing that. It took a couple of centuries to come from the Enlightenment to liberal democracy of the West today. And I think we are in the century in Islam today. The 21st century will be the time when what is really Islam? What part of Islam are we really that we Muslims should uphold as sacred and unchangeable, and what other aspects of the Islamic tradition that we have today can be, reinterpreted, is a question that we will face. And here's one example. Like, actually, we have changed the Islamic tradition. We have reformed the Islamic tradition significantly on a few issues. One example, slavery. Slavery is in Islamic law. The Quran encourages freeing a slave, but Islamic law, Islamic civilization did not abolish slavery until the 19th century. And beginning in the 19th century, with British influence on the Ottoman Empire, there began a campaign to ban or first the slave trade. The Ottomans banned slave trade, and there was a revolt in today's Saudi Arabia, then the peninsula, against the Ottomans, partly because of Ottomans banning slave trade, because it was in the Sharia. But then, throughout the 20th century, most Muslims accepted, yes, slavery should not be something that we should pursue. And today, probably universally, it's accepted that slavery is a thing of the past. And although it's in, classical jurisprudence, only ISIS, the craziest of all radical groups out there, made a case of reestablishing slavery in the middle of Iraq and Syria. And luckily now it's been uprooted to a great extent. So this shows that the tradition we have at hand carries the weight of history, and we can reinterpret it. If we did it on slavery, we can do it on women's rights, we can do it on the idea of equality between Muslims and non-Muslims. We can do this. And why would we do it? Be a good question. Because some Westerners want that from us, because they're drinking their whiskey in New York and say, oh, let the Muslims change, that would be nice for us. it can be nice for them, but not because it's nice for them. It is because of us. It is so that we can have Muslim societies from which we're proud of. We can have Muslim societies where people are not killed, persecuted, jailed, demonized because of what they think or what they believe, so that those societies can be more diverse, more open, more productive, more creative, and we would not have Muslims migrating from those countries to the West to find safe havens, to find security, and so on and so forth. Quite the contrary, people come to our countries. We should be the bright part of the world as we once were, like 10 centuries ago. And I think the way that goes through some religious reform, and this will happen organically, and it will happen through intellectuals, clerics, institutions going through and taking positions, more positions on certain things. And there are already efforts like that, but we need more and more. So this is what I can say as an introduction to today's talk. Thanks again, Ali, for having me on this, and thanks to everybody for joining.
Thank you, Mustafa, and thank you for this opening talk. I think you have laid out the basis of discussion very clearly. And my take is that you are focusing on reforms within the religious tradition, interpretation of religious sources to answer and address the modern problems. You have mentioned about women rights, you mentioned about slavery, and you've mentioned that how the rigidity, maybe the in traditional religious sources still is an obstacle. And we'll be moving on to the questions and answers. I'll ask a starting question right now, and just for the others who want to join the discussion, I understand that you will be able to show hand or press a button on your screen, and then I'll see who is interested in asking a question or a comment, and then I will hand over the mic.
Can I add one more thing, 1 minute before we move to questions?
Okay,
Just
go
as an
ahead.
additional thought. Okay. I should also add some of our problems today not come from tradition, but from the destruction of tradition being modernized in a very bad way. Like what I mean here, modernity in itself is not a blessing. Like in the 20th century, for example, the civil society tradition we had before was replaced by all-encompassing states, Arab states, and in Turkey, the Republican Turkey, for example. Republican Turkey this confiscated the foundations in the Ottoman Empire, foundations of Muslims and non-Muslims, and take it under the control. So it was actually the tradition had allowed some freedom and diversity, and now we went to a kind of modernity that was authoritarian, hierarchical. It was inspired by fascism from Europe. So I should also add that it's not just about getting everything in the tradition. It's also about seeing we also moved away from tradition sometimes in destructive ways and making a whole picture out of about all this. I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Okay, that's very clear. Do we have any starting initial comments right now? I have turned on the Q&A mode, and you can ask a question, and I can start.
There's a yacht coming.
Okay. So we have three speakers. I think I'll start with Linda. Okay, go ahead, Linda. And please, Do turn on your microphone, all the participants.
I can't see what to do. Can you hear me? No.
Yes, Linda.
You can hear me. Okay.
Yes, Linda.
I've now forgotten my question. I'll have to rethink. What I wanted Mustafa to talk more about was how you think these changes can come about. As you said, there's no central authority. So they come about by discussions and people building on discussions and ideas becoming accepted, or how can you see it happening?
Can I answer that, Ali?
Yes, please go ahead, Mustafa.
Yeah, well, that's $1 million question, as they say. Nice to hear from you, Linda, by the way. Well, in a sense, this is a national issue. Like in every nation, in Muslim, predominantly Muslim majority nation, there are authorities. In Malaysia, there is Jakim, the official institution for religion. In Turkey, there is a Diyanet, the Director of Religious Affairs. In Egypt, there's Al Azhar. So these institutions are important, and the positions they will take are important. Those institutions are not going to define everybody, like define religion for everybody. There will be dissenting opinions, but they can define a certain mainstream. And if they come out and say, well, we have gone through this renewal and so on and so forth, and it will, and we were taking this position on this particular issue, it will change the mainstream dynamic. Of course, will those institutions do that? Will they be allowed or encouraged by the political authorities who generally have a grip on these institutions? That's a part of the picture. So, I mean, Enlightenment moved forward partly because there were some states, princes supporting Enlightenment ideas and so on and so forth. So, although we don't want to see the state in the picture in all these issues, the state is there. So, whether the state will encourage more, let's say, liberal-leaning thoughts in positions, in jurisprudential positions, will allow education based on that, will allow diversity, and that is really important. So it is there again. There is nobody, and it's just a change of mood over time. And one thing I'd like to say is that this is not going very. I mean, there has been little progress in the past 2 centuries, if you will, partly because while we are having this talk and this need, Muslims are also being suffocated, and they're feeling their back against the wall because of Western hegemony, and because of colonial war, because of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and because of this and that. So to change the political dynamics in the world and making them less confrontational between East and West, between Muslims and others, can also be a part of the picture. It's a political issue, but it will influence attitudes in the Muslim world. So, and it's about intellectuals. Intellectuals have more power among Muslims than ever before. There's something called Muslim. So writers, having opinions, columns, TV show, clerics, single cleric TV shows. So those are important. And what is the intra-Muslim issue? And honest discussion among Muslims is needed about why do we need it. And the only thing we can do is to inject ideas into it and encourage this more. It's a very difficult and long process, and it differs from society to society. Does this answer the question?
Yeah, can you still hear me, or have I been switched off?
I do hear you.
Linda, you're still on. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's thank you very much. That's very helpful. So the sort of things the Istanbul Network is doing, and a lot of other organizations, they're sort of part of this story.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Linda, for this opening question. I am moving to Iyad al-Baghdadi now, who is also running a similar organization, a Kawakabi Foundation. Iyad.
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, Iyad, we can hear you.
Quick question. Maybe I'm basically diving straight into it. And this is kind of the debate as it was stuck in 2013 before before the Arab Spring kind of took a turn towards more jihadi violence. There were people arguing on both sides of the reform formula. Some people were of the opinion that political reform has to come first, and their argument was that there's it's not really possible to do any kind of intellectual reform when you don't have regimes or society that are afforded any kind of political rights or freedom of speech, where it's very easy for people who actually want to do any kind of reform. As you well know, Mustafa, both me and you are exiles now. So it is the situation that, I mean, there are people who are arguing on this side saying that political reform has to come first so that we can do our job. And then there are those saying the opposite. They were saying that no, religious reform or social reform or cultural reform has to come first. And you know, to be honest, their argument was adopted by authoritarian regimes because that's how you perpetuate the problem. And you say, hey, we cannot have political rights until we know that, like Islamists are not going to take over if we have a democracy and basically slaughter everyone. So maybe I would like to hear what you have to say about this, how we can chart a solution, if any, because it seems to me that this is the impasse.
Thank you, Iyad. First of all, good to hear from you. And I'm not maybe technically an exile. I can still go back to Turkey, but I relocated a little bit to, for complicated reasons. But I see your point very well. There is no simple answer. There is no simple route. And I would say whatever step forward we see, let's embrace it. In a certain country, there can be political freedom first. There can be the overthrow of discussion and so on and so forth. In some other country, there can be a quote unquote enlightened despot that doesn't allow political freedoms much in the first place, but brings some educational reforms, supports more, opens research centers for revitalization of Islamic thought and so on and so forth. Let's take that as well. And I don't think there's no easy way. And like, very bad example, but it's a current example. Take today's Saudi Arabia, the new king in Saudi Arabia. Now, this new king, Mohammed bin Salman, MBC, right here. He's obviously an iron-handed ruler who's just jailing his opponents for corruption. Although corruption is a very relative concept in Saudi Arabia. It is clear. I don't see any, and also he's leading a disastrous war in Yemen and continuing the toxic policy of sectarian tension in the Middle East. There are horrible things to say about Saudi Arabia today. On the other hand, even if to get brownie points from the West, he allows women to drive, and he's going to allow them to travel alone, and I'll take that part. I'll say, okay, this is nice, but then I will have other issues. Whereas in some other Muslim country, you can have a political revolution. You have Salafi really maybe gaining the upper hand politically, so then you would have to deal with that. And in the Arab Spring, we saw that it is not easy. In the Arab Spring, we saw that heading towards something called like liberal democracy in the Muslim world is not going to come easy. Thank God Tunisia is going so far well. The recent protests haven't derailed it. But in this issue of where should political revolution come from, political reform, It depends. There is no easy way, and I would say let's be sympathetic to every step forward within the context of a particular country. Does this answer the question? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would add just a caveat here, which is that I mean, Mohammed bin Salman is pursuing these reforms, but he's putting Muslim reformers such as Salman al-Auda and Hassan al-Maliki in prison. Uh, so, in a sense, his own agenda of reform is really he's actually trying to preempt any kind of political reform. But I see your point in a sense that he's actually doing this because Saudi society has already transformed. He's doing this in response to the aspirations of a new generation of Saudi citizens who want to actually have citizenship. But I think it would be dangerous for us to be too uncritical of what you would call enlightened despots, because I think that would it might damage our cause, because there are lots of people who do look up to any voice for Muslim liberty. I think sometimes I feel that we don't appreciate our own niche and our own position highly enough. There are many people who are craving this kind of message, an Islamic liberty message, and I think it kind of it damages our own cause when we come out to be complacent about any kind of oppression.
That's absolutely fair and valid and a very important point. Yeah, I can't agree with you more. I'm not going to disagree with you on that at all. So good point. It's important to remind. And as I said, there is no simple way, but we should uphold liberty in any case, and never, of course, support a despot. I mean, another case is Sisi. I mean, he's the butcher of Egypt, the tyrant of Egypt. I mean, he's been speaking about, bringing moderate Islam, whatever, reform in Islam, and so on and so forth. He's saying this to Western capitals to get some sympathy and support, but he's nothing but a dictator, and he's actually harming Egyptian society for the future. So we should be very careful about that as well. And of course, that by using the term enlightened despots, I meant not people who really suppress their societies, but there can be, especially monarchies, that are not fully democratic, but that keep power, but they do some reforms that will transform their society towards a better future. Maybe Morocco, relatively Jordan, are maybe better examples. But and late Ottoman Empire was. But going into a despot simply because he's doing some cosmetic reforms, unless it's going to have some influence on society. That's a very fair important point.
Thank you, Iyad. Just a follow-up question on the discussion we are just having, Mustafa, now. When you were in Malaysia last time, there was like this intention which you showed when you, I, and Van Sefel were sitting together just a night before, or just 2 days before your detention, and you showed you showed a strong intention of engaging with the religious bureaucracy, right? Paradoxically, you were engaged, but on their own terms. And now you're again saying engagement with those authorities which sort of control religious and religious interpretation, as opposed to let's say so I think my question really is that how hopeful you are that once the state gets the power to interpret religion, then can it be engaged through dialogue or through other means?
Well, of course it can be engaged, and like I was in Malaysia for a few days, and they arrested me and luckily let me go next day, and I don't have much now, but influence there at all. But for example, the Islamic Renaissance Front that invited me there, Ahmed Farooq. I mean, he's still challenging those authorities, and in the name of a more liberal interpretation of Islam. And in Malaysia, an interesting discussion is going on between Jakim and its supporters, and who condemn liberalism and human rightsism, you know. And then there are other Muslims who are, with Islamic arguments, you know, opposing this kind of authoritarian understanding of Islam. Well, it has to be engaged, and of course politics will matter. It matters if, you know, the prime minister is supporting Jakim to, you know, pump up his base, and then you are of course in a weak spot. And if a new prime minister comes, you know, maybe Mahathir will come to the scene. I don't know Malaysian politics as well as you do for sure, but maybe things will change in the political scene as well. So politics and power behind rules, this or that rules authority is of course very definitive. But what can you do other than not engaging? I'm not saying provoking. I'm not saying, you know, defying, but still. And it's interesting that, for example, within the conservatives in Malaysia, I've also heard lately voices saying that instead of jailing these liberals, let's talk to them. Let's show that they're wrong. Yes, that's good. Let them show us we're wrong. So let's have a conversation. Let's have it on TV, you know, so people can see. Let's discuss whether, you know, Islam should be based on free choice or coercion. Let's discuss that. It will be great. So ultimately, these ideas, like let's say civil rights movement in the United States, how they come out? I mean, it came out some people defending it, and others denied it, oppressed it, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, it gained the upper hand. So I do believe in engaging, not provoking, not humanizing or condemning, but I do believe in engaging. Of course, preferably not by going to jail. There's some weird sound.
Okay, we go back to Linda for now. Linda? Linda, you have a question here? Okay.
Linda is back.
Yeah, we're taking her back. Linda,
Can
Linda,
you hear
please?
me now? Can you hear me
Yes.
now? Oh, okay. I can hear the funny sound too, Mustafa, but I can hear you through it. So,
Okay,
what about economic reform? Is sort of trying to go the route of economic reform, which I think we'd all want to do anyway, is that liable to, as people become more economically free and hopefully better, wealthier and things, is that liable to sort of ease the discussion about religious freedoms, political freedoms, do you think?
it's a very interesting question, Linda. I've been thinking about this for like a decade more, and I do, of course, believe economic reform is a part of the problem, part of the issue, and or the solution. And lack of economic freedom is a part of the lack of general freedom we're discussing in the Muslim world today. And also, it is easier and safer to argue for economic liberalism, I think, in the Muslim world compared to political or religious freedom. And how it will transform. It's not that when people open a company, they will next day become political or liberal. Religious liberals. It's not that, but one, if you look at Muslim society structurally today, you will see that a part of the problem is that there are very powerful, almost despotic states in most of them. In Arab republics like Egypt, the army controls a big chunk of the economy, the state controls a big chunk of the economy, which leads to huge amounts of corruption, which leads to lack of economic opportunity, which deprives people from thinking of the future in terms of having a job, and that was what led to, I mean, the revolution in Tunisia. So that big all controlling state is there, and a kind of statism, a lack of a market economy is the basis for that. And when you have such a state, that in itself creates an illiberalism, in the sense that people either try to gain the favors of that state or try to capture that state. State becomes this leviathan that is so important and powerful that everybody looks up to. This creates, not maybe in religious terms, but it does create and perpetuate a very illiberal political culture. And when you bring sometimes market into it, it just becomes crony capitalism. And I think part of the problem in the Muslim world today is that you either have quasi-socialistic huge states, or you have capitalism that is really more of a crony capitalism rather than a free market capitalism. Whereas when you have tendencies towards a free market capitalism, you see more positive attitudes emerging in society. So it's not that economy will transform, a free market economy will transform societies directly to liberal societies. I mean, we see somehow countries managing capitalism and authoritarianism at the same time, like we see in China for a long time. But opening up the economy is one of the long-term still paths to nurture a more liberal culture in society, where the state is less powerful and individuals open up. They open up to the world. They know more about the world, and they engage with other people in win-win situations rather than, you know, a competition for survival. Therefore, yes, economic transformation is important. Free market economy is important, and one of the problems, as I said at the end of my 15-minute talk, is that we moved from what was kind of a market-based, I mean, in some Muslim societies, to a more state-based economy in the 20th century because of a bad form of version of modernization. So breaking that spell is a part of the problem. But still, you will have to agree what's apostasy. You will have to, I mean, discuss what is blasphemy and so on and so forth. So it will not directly change religious doctrine, but it will ultimately change the social environment. In these issues can be discussed more freely, and more questions will come up.
Mustafa, there is one thing I always have in mind when there is a lot of criticism or let's say hostility towards reform-minded intellectuals who are based in Muslim majority countries. We have seen cases of exile. We have seen, they have left the countries, if not executed. So I understand you are not in exile exactly, but you're in a relatively free society and a free environment to speak. As opposed to before, well, let's say in Turkey or in Malaysia, they are very, of course, different environments. When we talk about the influence of your ideas, where do you think you have been, at least in your personal experience, more effective in terms of the outreach of your ideas based in a Muslim majority country which understandable risks, or let's say in a relatively free society but obviously still communicating through the publications and other tools?
Well, I mean, Turkey and Malaysia are different cases. In Malaysia, I got into trouble for, saying apostasy should not be a crime. In Turkey, that would not be an issue. In Turkey, saying something about a president would be an issue. In Turkey, there's a more of a political issue rather than a theological one that's going on. And in Turkey, I'm not like, I mean, I was in Turkey last summer. I will probably go this summer as well. I can go back to Turkey. I'm right now working in an American university, Wellesley College outside, which, gave a better job opportunity and yes, a safer and saner environment compared to today's very toxic and somewhat concerning context. but still, Turkey is a country in which you can discuss these theological jurisprudential issues. It's not technical to Islam, but in Turkey, the current crisis is political, I would say directly. This is just a note. And on the other question of, I mean, you're asking where do you have more influence? Communication in the world, that where you are really doesn't matter that much. 20, 30 years ago, of course, if you are in Turkey, you could, speak to people more directly. And now with Twitter, you speak wherever you are and people see you. Or, we make this conference as we're doing right now. The fact that I'm in Wellesley Massachusetts doesn't stop our friends from Iran, or, I see other names there, from being a part of the conversation. So thanks to globalization, thanks to communications, I think right now your location is not that important. Even if I was in Istanbul, sitting in Istanbul right now, what would I be doing? I would be doing this. I would be tweeting. I would be writing for the New York Times. I would be writing. Still, it would be going through my computer and so on. Yeah, I could go to speak to a conference that I can do now physically. But I think the world, and therefore the Muslim intellectual scene, has become globalized enough that your location is less important than it was before. Therefore, for Muslim liberal reformists, intellectuals who feel threatened in wherever they are, I would encourage to thinking of relocation if they have a chance, because it's better to be able to continue to speak in a different environment rather than being shut up, indefinitely, or at least for a while, by a government which is authoritarian.
Great. So there is some space for Q&A. I'll because there is some lag of a
One
few.
more thing, Ali,
Yes.
It is actually not physically where you speak. It is whether you are mentally still in the ummah. I think that is the key issue. I mean, some of the liberal reformist Muslims have gone so out of the mainstream, have gone so out of the community. They're speaking as if they are totally from the outside, and only to get support from the outside. And so it's the content of their speech that locates them somewhere. I think that's not going to help much to the issues we're discussing today. People can choose whatever they want. I mean, it's a caricaturish example, but I see, for example, names like Ayaan Hirsi Ali hailed as the great Islamic reformer, for example. Well, I mean, it's her choice. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is an ex-Muslim, or there might be people like her in that case. Well, they're not in the scene. They're not in Islam. They're outside of it, and actually quite sometimes critical, sometimes hostile to it. So that's of course a very extreme case. But I think regarding the Muslim intellectuals, liberals who are reformists, what matters is whether they are mentally in the ummah. And whether their location can be this or that.
Great. Thank you, Mustafa. We'll take some time for Q&A from other participants. We have Muhammad, and so I'm giving mic to Muhammad Basheen from Iran.
You hear me?
Yes, please go ahead, Muhammad.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out the role that non-Muslim people play in the discussion. Recently had a case in Iran that a Zoroastrian was elected as a local, governor, and it had, it offended a lot of people, a lot of Muslims that thought a non-Muslim should not govern Muslims, and stirred up such a big controversy. So what I was trying to ask you, you touched upon it very briefly, but the role that non-Muslims who live in the Ummah can play in this. I think their role may be very important, and they are often ignored.
Yeah.
But that's it.
Okay. Well, should I say something on that, Ali? Should I go on?
Yes, please go ahead, man.
Ali, are you there? Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear the news. I didn't know. I'd like to see more about that, actually. And yes, I mean, non-Muslims within the Ummah is a bleeding wound, actually, of the Ummah. We are typically proud when it comes to, minorities. We say, during the Middle Ages, Jews were being persecuted in Europe, and they came to Muslim lands, the Ottoman Empire, to find safe haven, which is true. So we have a tradition of having non-Muslims in our midst. And however, things got bitter gradually in the 20th century. Two things happened. First of all, non-Muslims in Muslim lands, Dar al-Islam, if you will, were tolerated. And again, some non-Muslims, most non-Muslims, but certain sects were not tolerated, or idolatry, for example, was not tolerated. Non-Muslims were tolerated, but they were not equal. And in pre-modern times, that was only normal. That was actually quite generous still. But in the modern era, with the idea of citizenship, with the idea of equality before law, there came the demand that we should be all equal. And that equality of Muslims and non-Muslims, a lot of reforms have taken place, beginning from the Ottoman Empire to today. But it's still not culturally accepted by all Muslims. It's not legally accepted in some Muslim states, but also culturally, there's a kind of Muslim supremacy idea that, of course, Muslims are the ruling class and others can be tolerated, but they cannot be the rulers. And the discussion takes place in Indonesia, in Iran, in Egypt, whether, Christians or non-Muslims can take positions in government, can become, rulers, and can become the head of state, and so on and so forth. And that is, I think we have this problem that our medieval system was really admirable for its time, that it tolerated, that it created some room for non-Muslims and diversity, but in the modern era, it gradually began to look oppressive because the idea of equality came to the scene, and the notion of freedom. It is important that developments like that you told me are taking place. We should have more of it, and of course, we have the burning question of. We tolerate Jews and Christians, but what about Muslims who are actually having a unorthodox point of view, like Ahmadis, let's say, in Pakistan? Actually, they are persecuted more than non-Muslims because they have a claim that is within Islam that goes against history. Then they become heretics and they're suppressed more. There needs to be a culture of recognition that people are not going to be discriminated against or persecuted because of what they believe in and who they are. And it's a legal matter, it's a cultural matter as well. And how do we achieve this? I'll tell you one conversation I had with a prominent, not conversation, like a column conversation, because I was writing a column at the time in Turkey. There's Hayrettin Karaman, Turkey's probably the most prominent Islamic jurist in Turkey. I mean, if there's, Karadawi in our world, Hayrettin Karaman is a figure like that in Turkey. He's writing a column for Yeni Şafak, a prominent Islamic pro-government newspaper. and he's a professor emeritus of Islamic jurisprudence and so on and so forth. He wrote a column in 2013 saying that non-Muslims in Muslim lands and secular people, he categorized them as also like a kind of a dhimmi category. Said that they can of course live in Muslim societies, but they have to show respect to the majority and do not unveil their practices that are a little disturbing to the majority. They should know their place, and they should not, for example, publicly drink because it's offensive to Muslims and so on and so forth. And I took up on that and I said, okay, if this is a good principle that the minority should, honor the majority's sensibilities and, put its head down accordingly. What is the situation of Muslims in France? Should they take their headscarves off because it offends the French sensibilities of laïcité? Should they not ask for halal food and go for pork in schools, as some French secularists are asking for? We probably wouldn't do that. So if we want something for the Muslim minority in France, which is lack of discrimination, which is full respect, which is full acceptance, maybe we should do the same thing here. Or if we don't do it here, well, how can we justify it there? So forcing, I think, Muslims to consider their attitudes when it is upside down, when they are not the majority but the minority, which is a new phenomenon in the world, by the way. In classical era Islam, you don't have Muslim minorities living in non-Muslim lands. It was not an issue. There was no immigration. There was no like that today. So these are the kind of dialogues that we need. And should a Muslim be elected as a governor in America? Sure, why not? We would like that, right? We'd be happy to see that. So then why not somebody be elected in Iran or elsewhere as a governor if they are from whatever religious community they are coming from? If you don't accept that, how do we justify that? So we should force that kind of rethinking on whether we have double standards or do we have a standard. If you have double standards, how do we justify that? Does this give any answer to your thought? I don't know. I mean, your question.
Yeah, I understand it does. There is no follow-up question right now from Muhammad. Anyone else in the queue? Oh, Khalud is here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead, Khalud.
Hi. First of all, thank you for this amazing opportunity. It's been very informative for someone such as myself who's a layman and is very much interested in this topic. So forgive me if my question comes across as something that's not very well structured. I originally come from Libya, and right now, as you know, with the political situation, it's very, there is instability everywhere. So my question is, how can Islamic reform take place in a country that is predominantly tribal, that the only ruling, or not necessarily ruling, but the one religious authority that seems to have the most, what's the word? Or rather, the main religious authority, I should say, the Dar al-Ifta, seems to be against anything that, could possibly be seen as Western, that could possibly be seen as, air quotes, enlightened, and specifically, if it's related to women's rights. Anything related to women's rights is automatically seen as being something that is dangerous to the Libyan society, to the Islamic society, to the moral fiber of the Libyan society, etc. I mean, I don't want to digress. Really, how can someone even start to fight something like this, or not even necessarily fight, because, or rather to challenge, these people that are in such a place of authority, more so from my own, like I said, limited exposure. It seems to be as if religion is being used as a tool to control the masses. And because no one will dare to question anything that comes from, you know, a religious authority or a religious edict, because everyone would be too scared. Because the moment you start, you know, becoming critical of anything to do with religion, you're in danger, or you're seen as being someone who's looking to corrupt the air quotes young minds in society. So it would be great to hear your opinions about something like that.
Sure, thanks.
Thank
Wow,
you, Khulud.
it's a difficult situation there, right? And first of all, on tribalism, that is a trouble we have in Libya, in certainly Afghanistan, and in other parts of the Muslim world. Suffocates the individual and keeps very archaic traditions, patriarchal traditions, and also easily can lead to conflict between who would have some tribal affiliations. Tribalism will be cured in the long run. I will say for capitalism. Only in a market-based to them by and of course a central state that treats citizens as citizens, not just a member of that tribe, is of course important. And like which transformation, which would take a couple of generations probably. How do you deal with though? How do you prevent tension between? If you have tribes, the only short-term solution is to create some tribal alliances and some basic peace between them. And in Libya, that was actually made by Gaddafi in a very despotic way for decades. And when Gaddafi was overthrown, you had the collapse of the existing order, and what emerged was conflict between the tribes. So they're settled through some negotiation between all those warring parties. Libya will unfortunately be, I think, a very unstable nation for a while. Now, in this environment, how can you speak about enlightenment, reform, and so on and so forth? It's not going to be very easy, and that's not the need. I mean, the first need is probably security and to find a means to end the war. But I'll tell one thing: in an environment like this, I would not recommend going there and quoting John Locke or John Stuart Mill or I don't know, more liberal feminists, or it's not going to have much impact. But I would still recommend finding bases in classical traditional Islam against some of the misogynist practices that we see. Because misogyny, the oppression of women, comes sometimes from archaic religious texts. Sometimes it comes from not even religious, totally patriarchal traditions. And religion is sometimes your best, actually, defense, because it's a source of legitimacy against those patriarchal traditions. For example, female genital mutilation. I'm not sure if it's popular in Libya, but it's certainly practiced in more, let's say, eastern part of North Africa. How do you argue against female genital mutilation? Well, the best that you would have would be to actually rely on traditional Islamic scholars who would say this is un-Islamic. You don't need a big modern feminist liberal reform for that. There are grounds to say this is un-Islamic and it's a practice that is not in the Quran, in the prophetic tradition. There are some of these people used to justify female genital mutilation, but there are arguments against that as well. So within that very tribal traditional context, the best you can do is to find roots within the traditional still frame of reference to argue against the most toxic practices you would have today. The transformation of that into a modern liberal society of and so on and so forth, that will take quite a while. And the first goal, even before that, should be to stop jet and conflict and finding a medium of tribal compromise and peace. Does this make any sense? I don't know. Hello? Thanks. I saw that FGM is not practiced in Libya. That is nice. I don't see Ali in the presenters line, and I don't see anybody else in the Q&A line. Is there any other question? Okay. Maybe the Malaysian religious police is not happy with the content of our conversation, blocking all these internet connection. Okay. We're sorry for Ali. I hope he's okay. I hope there's no problem. We could continue the Q&A session. Okay, so there's no Ali. It's just me and you guys. And yeah, if there are questions and additional questions, I will be happy to answer. If there are no questions, that's fine too. Don't feel forced. I have a question. Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's a question. I will read the question. I have a question. Are we creating a problem for ourselves by talking about the entire 1.1 billion Muslims living almost all over the world? Yeah, yes, we are. I mean, we are, when we're speaking of a collective called the Ummah, we are inevitably taking a risk. But we should always remind ourselves that the Muslim world is very, very complex and very, very diverse. First of all, societies are very different. Bosnia is very different from Afghanistan. Arab countries in themselves are very different. Libya has tribal issues. I mean, but there's no FGM and then female genital mutilation. If you go to Syria, you would have a different scene. If you, I mean, there are different political systems, of course. I mean, there are absolute monarchies, constitutional monarchies, or republics, authoritarian republics. There's Turkey as a big case itself. There, so it is. So there is no single Muslimhood. That's key. But then, on the other hand, if we're going to speak about European problems, if we're going to speak about North America, so a collective also called the Ummah, which is diverse in itself, and I think we should be able to talk about that. I think Ali is back.
Hi, sorry, this is not Ali. I'm Isabel. I'm the executive officer here at Istanbul Network. So I'll be taking over Ali now, cause he's currently in Pakistan and his internet is not working.
Can I, Isabel, continue with us and read them here and answer them?
So there's a follow-up question from.
Okay. Uh, I will just take up a few questions that I think, speaking of nation states, I think Tunisia still continues to be the best political experiment so far in the Middle East. You guys probably know that I was very optimistic about Turkey's potential to become a exemplary political model. Turkey was doing pretty well, 2012 or 11, maybe 13. Unfortunately, Turkey went down in a downward spiral, and I am not sure whether we hit the bottom yet in Turkey. It's a kind of revenge of the conservatives from the secularists after being excluded for a century, and the zeal and the excitement of that has not calmed down yet. So therefore, when I look, I see Tunisia, and why Tunisia is a good example, just because I think, in my view, mainly because it's been able to show that consensus works. The Middle Eastern politics is defined by confrontation most of the time. Tunisia has shown us that consensus can work, and although it's a country with poor economic resources, going through economic tension, which was recently highlighted protests, but I think it's still the best example we have. Indonesia is still an interesting case. In the Balkans, you have Bosnia. And in different Muslim societies, you have, of course, different inclinations towards reform and change. But if you want me to point out to one promising Muslim political experiment today, I would still point to Tunisia. And adding that, there are some stable monarchies in the Arab world, like Morocco, that are doing, for their own ways, relatively better than some of the so-called revolutionary republics. So Yad also says, there's a question of whether we are doing reform at the brink of a major global shift anyway. Well, that is true. The major global shift is actually away from liberalism, because the liberalism itself is being challenged in the West. And it's really hard to argue at a time when people are declaring the end of liberalism in the West. We're arguing for more liberalism in the Muslim world. However, what I think is that we're not seeing the end of liberalism. We are not going to reverse the gains of liberalism, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, equality for law. What has happened in the past decade is that globalization triggered an illiberal response in many societies, because globalization brought people face to face, and people freaked out from what they saw. People fear difference, and people fear different opportunities. So we are now seeing a resurgence against globalization and nationalism, therefore, in all corners of the world, including even in the West. But this doesn't mean, I think, we are going back to a pre-Enlightenment dark era of just autocratic nation states fighting each other. It will be just a difficult century in all ways, and a part of the difficulty is global, part of the difficulty is within the Muslim world. What will happen to Islam after ISIS shock? First of all, we should get what ISIS shock as well. I don't agree with people who say ISIS has nothing to do with Islam. it has something to do with Islam in the sense that it has been the most fanatic of all Salafi jihadist groups that we have seen so far. And I think it has shown us how dangerous a certain ideological trend in Islam can become when it is taken to its extremes. It is like Khmer Rouge. What Khmer Rouge was for communism, I think ISIS was for Islamism. Most of the communists would find Khmer Rouge, which killed 3 million people in Cambodia in 2 years, shockingly horrific, but it had come out of some of the precepts of communism. And I think the same thing is said for ISIS. Well, if you take the right lessons, ISIS will show us that, well, if you think that there's no need for any reform in jurisprudence, here you go. So you can end up in going all the way to ISIS, establishing slavery in the middle of the 21st century. So in that sense, ISIS was a wake-up call, I think, for change and reform. Whether we'll get the lesson or not, I don't know. And ISIS will not die as an idea. It will pop up in here and there as franchises in the name of, as is Boko Haram or Shabab in Africa or elsewhere. Now, Khulud asks about Turkey. Muhammad asks, okay, I was hoping to hear a little bit more about Turkey. Wasn't sure if it was within the scope of the talk. Well, Turkey is, here's Turkey in a nutshell, because I'm Turkish and I mean, you might be thinking, I've supported Erdogan. I've supported the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, for a long time. Because it seemed that Turkey was under the control of the secularists, the Kemalists for a century, which were secular but neither democratic nor liberal. And AKP came by embracing some liberal ideas against these secularists and accomplishing EU reforms. It was the dream of, seeing Islam and political liberalism being synthesized. It was a great. So I have a chapter on that on my book, Islam Without Aims. So I saw that and I thought that this is what's happening, but I was too early to judge. I think Erdogan and his supporters embraced liberal ideas pragmatically. It was helpful in the early 2000s against the secular establishment, against the military. But once they grabbed and captured power, they don't need those ideas anymore. And they just started to go back to their ideological roots and just it turned into, the conservatives dominating the system rather than building a system of equality. And I think there is a sense, a century-long revenge, century-long yearning for power, and the more they got power, the more they corrupted, and it went on and on. And they faced some fierce reactions, and those reactions made them more fanatic. On the other hand, a power struggle emerged among religious conservatives, supporters of Erdogan versus the followers of cleric Gülen, and that turned into a kind of Stalinist versus Trotskyite war. Gülen and his group are not clean, I should emphasize that, and I think they were really behind the coup attempt and some other things that has been going on in Turkey in the past couple of years. But it turned into an intra-Islamist rivalry war, which surpassed anything else and destroyed, the institutions of the state as well. So today, Turkey is in a very toxic state of mind, and Erdogan seems to be willing to stay in power for as long as he lives. And to be able to do that, he's clinging on to power and with more constraints on the media, with actually dominating almost the whole media. So Turkey, I don't think will be anytime soon, going back to the nice liberal reformist country it was until 4 or 5 years ago. So this is just a point in Turkey. And Khulud asked, thank you, I would add, yes, absolutely, until the political situation is stable, the security is maintained. Okay, it was just a comment, thank you. And Iyad says, I get the feeling in Arab societies debates that ISIS has been a shock to the Islamist project and to the Islamic orthodoxy or traditionism. There's a loss of legitimacy among the mainstream, and it appears that the ideological scene is going to open up very soon, which may be an opportunity for people like us. Great. I mean, yeah, you know the Arab world much better than me. So if that is the case, if ISIS has been the wake-up call, then that's good. I just think that people will not say, I hope people will not say, just like every failed communist experiment, oh, this was a wrong one, we should try it again. And I think we should soberly look into ISIS and try to understand what happened and why it happened, and what are the lessons to draw from that disastrous experiment. They could justify almost everything they did by finding fatwas in classical Sunni jurisprudence. So we should, I mean, those fatwas were not implemented, some of them were obsolete, some of them were just on paper but not being put in practice. They did it, they put it on practice proudly, aggressively, and here we ended up by ISIS. So we should take a lesson from that. If people realize that, yeah, as you say, then ISIS can be a good wake-up call for reform, the kind of reform we're talking about.
Thank you, Mustafa. I think that's a very good closing point to our webinar. So, because of the time restriction, we have to end our webinar. Yeah, so I would like to thank Mustafa. Thank you for your time in joining us, and also thank you to all the participants for joining us. I would really like to apologize for all the technical difficulties. It's our first webinar, and we will do our very best to improve our next one, and we hope that you could join us for our next one next month. And regarding Ali, he's currently in Pakistan right now, so he's having issues with his internet connection, which is why he had to leave.
Okay, the Pakistani rule, this police got him there. Okay. No, I'm kidding. Okay,
yeah, maybe.
Let me thank the Istanbul Network and to all our friends who joined the conversation. Thanks for sparing your time for me, and I hope we had an hour together, and I hope we'll see more reform in the Muslim world, and let's go for it.
Okay, thank you so much, Mustafa. And to all the participants, after we end this event, you will have the opportunity to give us your review and maybe comments. So we hope that you could give us a few comments on how we could improve ourselves. Okay, thank you so much, Mustafa, and we hope to see you again soon.
Best wishes and many salams, and thanks to everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.